What is Occultism? A Philosophical and Critical Study. By Gerard Anaclet Vincent in Cos. Papus. Chapter 1. What is Occultism? Occultism. The assembly of theories, practices, and paths of realization derived from occult science. Occultism presents itself throughout the ages as a very distinct whole, possessing its own theories, methods, and even personal processes of diffusion and teaching. Hence the difficulty in truly knowing this doctrine for those who have not penetrated the centers where it is taught, and the numerous errors committed by critics who have judged it without knowing it. Before expounding upon occultism in detail, let us briefly establish what differentiates it from other philosophical systems. The theory contained in the various sections of occult science, which we are obliged to define immediately, so as to avoid confusion with the divinatory arts that are sometimes called occult sciences. 1. While science, as conceived by contemporary scholars, primarily studies physical phenomena and the accessible and visible part of nature and man, occult science, thanks to its preferred method, analogy, strives, starting from physical facts, to elevate itself to the study of the invisible, hidden part of nature and man. Hence its first characteristic as the science of the occult. 2. While contemporary science disseminates its discoveries and practices through journals and public experiments, occult science divides its investigations into two categories. One part that may be published to aid the progress of humanity, one part that must be reserved for a select group of men, hence the second characteristic of this occult science. 3. Finally, while intellectual tests are the only ones required of candidates for contemporary faculties and great scientific schools, centers of occult teaching require, in addition, various moral tests, and entrust their teaching only to experienced men capable of never employing for evil the knowledge they might acquire. Thus, all books and publications referring to reserved subjects are written according to a special symbolic method, which further reveals the science under the new aspect of the science of concealing. Such is the theoretical basis upon which both ancient and contemporary occultism rest. We have no judgment to pass on these various points, and must confine ourselves to the exposition of a subject very fond of obscurity, so as not to demand our undivided attention. Occultism is, therefore, the representative of a sort of special scientific society, distinct from universities. And, since there have always been men who prefer its methods to those of mainstream science, since it possesses a particular literature and fosters a sovereign disdain for exclusively material methods of investigation, since, ultimately, initiatory occult fraternities still exist in our day in almost all countries, it seems indispensable to us to analyze this system. 1. From the philosophical point of view. 2. From the historical point of view. 3. From the point of view of its special paths of diffusion and realization in various epochs. Furthermore, we must make a necessary distinction between the theoretical part and the practical or experimental part, generally known under the name of magic. Chapter 2. Theory. Occultism from the philosophical point of view. Occultism, being a complete philosophical system, must be studied regarding its teachings on psychology, metaphysics, logic, morals, aesthetics, theodicy, sociology, and various other theoretical applications that we will analyze successively and in this order, before taking up its history. From the psychological point of view, the first and most important problem that arises is that of the relationship between the spiritual principle and the material principle, or the means of union between the soul and the body. This leads us to the definition of the constitution of man, as understood by occultists, regarding which they have never varied their teachings in any era. Thus, the Egyptians of the 15th dynasty described the properties and characteristics of the Ka, or luminous double, exactly as Paracelsus described this astral body in the 16th century of our era, and as Eliphas Levi studied the fluidic double in 1863. For occultists, man is constituted as a single whole by three principles, attuned into a general unity. 1. The psychic body, considered solely as the product and support of the other elements. 2. The astral body, doubly polarized, which unites the inferior, psychic, to the superior, spiritual. 3. The immortal spirit. Of these various elements, only one is particular to occultists. It is the second, or astral body, the other two being studied with care, the first by anatomists and physiologists, the third by psychologists and philosophers. This constitution of man into three principles is so characteristic of traditional occultism that it is sufficient to determine its representatives in all eras, and allows one to distinguish, within occultism itself, the truly traditional schools from the aberrations or inept compilations made in various epochs under the occult veil. Concerning the human entity, the teaching may be summarized in these propositions. 1. Man is constituted by three principles, synthesized into a unity, or the doctrine of triunity. 2. Man is analogous to the universe, or the doctrine of the microcosm or small world and the macrocosm or great world. 3. There is a correspondence between each element of man and its analog in the universe. This is the doctrine of correspondences, upon which magic is based and of which we shall speak again in due course. In all this, what interests us for the moment is the astral body, this plastic mediator that classical philosophers condemned without taking the trouble to study it carefully, and which reappears in all eras under sometimes different names, yet with identical characteristics in the works of occultists. To know the astral body well is to possess the most important of the keys to the doctrine that occupies us. Let us pause, therefore, for a moment on the reasons given by occultists in support of their claims. The employment of analogy permits the use of comparisons, not to demonstrate but to clarify a matter. Let us begin, then, by establishing a comparison designed to shed some light on the subject. Man is compared to an equipage, where the carriage represents the physical body, the horse, the astral body, and the coachman, the spirit. This image allows one to clearly understand the role of each principle. The carriage is inert by itself and corresponds to the physical body, as conceived by the occultist. The brain governs the steering via the reins, without participating in the direct traction. Such is the role of the spirit. Finally, the horse, connected to the carriage by the shafts and to the coachman by the reins, moves the entire system, without concerning itself with the direction. This image clearly indicates to us the character of the astral body, the true horse of the organism, which moves and does not direct. It remains for us to see if this comparison corresponds to a real entity, and if there really exists within us a motor principle, distinct from the directing principle. It is to psychology and to anatomy that contemporary occultists have turned to prove the assertions of their forefathers in this regard. There exists within us a nervous system of organic life, placed under the almost exclusive canopy of the great sympathetic nerve, which acts on organs of special constitution. This system moves throughout the entire organism, from the finest of arteries down to the intestines during sleep. In the waking state, the striated muscle fibers add the action of the brain, the seat of the spirit, to this process, and thus the coachman of the organism demonstrates that his role is quite distinct from that of the horse, which represents the great sympathetic nerve, served by its plexuses and its multiple vasomotor nerves. As soon as we sleep, cerebral functions cease, and only the system of organic life continues its action. It digests food, manufacturing chyle and lymph, circulates the blood, and distributes force and matter everywhere. It does even more, for it is what presides over the organism's defense, dispatching leukocytes to the attacked point and healing wounds caused by imprudence or accident. Now, here is this principle that Paracelsus calls the hidden worker, and its domain is entirely separate from the domain of the spirit, which has other things to do rather than presiding over the delights of chylification and excretion. Such are the teachings of the occultists concerning the relationships of the astral body with the physical body. Let us see what they say to explain its relations with the spirit. The astral body, being the soul within the human entity, presides over the elaboration of all organic forces. Among these, one interests us from the standpoint of cerebral actions, the nervous force. The force that circulates in the nerves was studied from the viewpoint of its speed and was clearly differentiated from electricity and other physical forces. Like all organic fabrications, it is drawn from the blood, as proven by the cerebral disturbances caused by anemia or hyperemia, and here again the astral body presides over this elaboration. The nervous force acts alongside the spirit, just as electricity acts alongside the telegrapher, the material brain representing the telegraph. Occultists refute materialistic arguments by asserting that the latter have confused the telegrapher with the nervous force, or the spirit with its sole means of communication with the organism. Take the electricity away from the telegrapher, and he will seem not to exist to his correspondent, because he will be unable to send the slightest dispatch. It is thus that, in normal or induced sleep, in severe illnesses, or in fainting spells, there is a displacement of nervous force or a cessation of its habitual production, and, for lack of its indispensable means of action, the spirit is also unable to manifest its presence, just as the clerk is unable to send a dispatch without electricity. We have chosen examples drawn from contemporary sciences to expound the doctrines of occultism in a clear manner and to avoid the revival of a multitude of technical terms that would only encumber our exposition. One sees now that this plastic mediator is something more than a pure philosophical conception, and that this idea does not seem to correspond to a physiological reality. Let us proceed with our analysis of the astral body. It is now that we shall turn to the few experimenters who, in recent years, wish to verify in a positive manner the possibilities for examination presented by these ancient and eternally identical teachings. Occultists assert, in effect, that the nervous system of organic life is nothing more than the temporary support of the constituent principle of the plastic mediator, and that this principle is luminous when seen independently of material organs, which is to say that this principle can radiate around the body in which it is normally enclosed. According to technical expression, this exit of the astral body can be incomplete, that is, partial or total. In the first case, we witness certain phenomena studied by magnetizers and spiritists, of which we will speak in regard to practice. In the second case, the duplication of the individual can be verified at a distance by several witnesses. This is the case with several saints of Christianity, and this is how occultists explain the majority of so-called telepathic facts and spiritist phenomena of materialization in most serious experiments not due to fraud. Several contemporary investigators wish to verify these assertions experimentally, recording the produced phenomena on photographic plates or by means of purely mechanical devices to avoid hallucinations. Physical investigations of this kind were summarized in the two works of one of the experimenters, Mr. A. de Roches. A first series of trials was conducted on the exteriorization of sensibility, and the results were very clear, confirming occultist theories about the radiation of the astral body. The second series, carried out largely by means of a special patient, Eusapia Palladino, and in the presence of numerous and impartial investigators, was directed toward the study of the movements of objects at a distance and without contact, and further confirmed the close relationship between the medium's nervous force and the effects produced, under the name of exteriorization of motricity. These trials are very recent and have not yet been verified by enough experimenters to take their place in classical science, much like the investigations of Dr. Baraduk and Messrs. Lies and David, or of Mr. Narkiewicz Iadko, on the photographic recording of effluvia, which, moreover, were contested by Dr. Gebhard. There is simply a tendency here to confirm occultist theories through the processes of contemporary science and by experimenters who are by no means occultists, which deserve to be noted in this place. This astral body, therefore, has the following different roles, according to occultism. 1. It unites, through a double polarization, the physical body to the spirit. 2. It is the hidden worker that performs the functions of vegetative life and preserves the material body, which ceaselessly maintains and repairs its form, despite the continuous death of physical cells, and its functional harmony, despite illnesses and imprudences. 3. Finally, it can radiate around the individual, forming a kind of invisible atmosphere called the astral aura, and it can even exteriorize itself completely. It is thanks to these various properties of the astral body that occultists explain visions and actions at a distance, presentiments, prophetic ecstasy, dreams, madness, and other phenomena classified by philosophers under special psychology and in the chapter of coincidences and hallucinations. We cannot leave psychology without saying a word about the doctrines of occultism regarding the feminine principle on the various planes and, especially, on the human plane. Femininity, for the occultist, is complementary and necessary to every active principle. Woman is therefore neither superior nor inferior to man. She is complementary, physiologically as well as anatomically. Woman is the materialization in humanity of the universal plastic faculty, symbolized by the dove. She develops and perfects the things that man creates. That is why she must develop her soul faculties, while man must insist upon the development of his intellectual faculties. To seek to demonstrate that woman is inferior to man is like seeking to determine if the zinc pole is superior, because it is active, to the carbon pole which remains passive in the battery. They are both indispensable to the production of the current, and if they leave their respective poles, the current no longer flows. This dual polarity exists not only in the different sexes, but also within the individual. The heart is always complementary to the brain, and, consequently, is positive in the woman and negative in the man. By heart, one must understand the feelings and the soul faculties, which occultists locate in the cardiac plexus as the point of origin, with the brain serving, in this case, only as a center of return. Because triunity is an absolutely general law, each of the three organic centers of man, the belly, the chest, and the head, has its very personal anatomical, physiological, and psychological functions. Sensations are localized in the solar plexus and constitute, along with the thoracic enlargement of the spinal cord, the center of localization for feelings, and, finally, the sympathetic plexuses of the head constitute the center of animal intellectuality that forms our lower unconscious. These three lower psychological centers, which Plato described and out of which some have made three souls, are dominated and brought back to the unity of consciousness by the immortal spirit, tasked with restraining and directing the central passional or intellectual impulses that assault it from the various organic centers. It is from the more or less intense action of reason and will upon these various impulses that the greater or lesser strength of free will in each of us, as well as personal responsibility, is born. Man, being the microcosm, contains within himself analogically all the psychologies of the lower kingdoms, represented by his three segments, the belly corresponding to the plant kingdom and the head to the animal kingdom. Reciprocally, each animal is nothing more than the materialization of a psychological impulse that will be found in man. The tiger, the ox, the ant, the bee, and the pig are nothing more than living symbols, each representing a faculty of organic man, and the use of these correspondences provides the key not only to magical rites but also to the aesthetics derived from the teachings of the occult tradition. The souls of animals are the result of an evolution, and they will evolve further until they have reached the animal part of man, whereas the immortal spirit is the result of a descent of an involution, as occultists say. It is in reference to this teaching that an ancient once said, "The souls of animals come from the earthly fire, while human souls come from heaven." We have been purposefully prolix regarding psychology, and we will proceed more quickly to the other sections of occult philosophy. If psychology offers us, in the problem of the union of soul and body, the opportunity to specify the special theories of occultism in this regard, metaphysics will show us personal applications of occult philosophy to the solution of the most important of metaphysics problems, the passage from being to reality, or the subjective to the objective. When occultists assert that the solution to this kind of problem resided in the existence of a doubly polarized intermediary, some claimed that they were fleeing from the difficulty instead of resolving it. And yet, the astral body is an organic reality and not a philosophical conception. The same occurs between being and physical reality, through which the occultist intends to solve this important problem. To give an initial idea of the functioning of this astral plane, let us draw once again from a contemporary application, photography, some necessary examples. Theoretically, the passage from the object to produce the photographic image of that object should be done directly and without an intermediary. A philosopher of the classical school would not fail to say that this intermediary is a useless invention, and would cite the example of the painter or the draftsman, who directly reproduce the object on parchment or paper without needing any intermediary whatsoever. And yet, the photographer first obtains a negative plate, that is, one in which all the colors are the inverse of physical nature, and it is by having light itself operate an inversion of the first result it provided, that the artist obtains the positive print similar to the model. This plate, which theoretically could be understood as useless, plays, on the contrary, a very important role, since it allows for the obtaining of an indefinite series of positive images. Now, for occultism, the astral plane is nothing but the plane of negative plates or models from which all physical objects are, each of them, prints pulled in a greater or lesser number of copies, by special agents. The passage from the subjective to the objective is thus justified. And this doctrine of intermediaries plays such a role in occultism that we would encounter it in connection with the journey of the idea. Thought is considered, in the occult tradition, as one of the most powerful and effective forces in action within the universe. Ideas are active agents of happiness or unhappiness, depending on the character of their center of emission and the intensity of this emission. The question of their primitive origin, an entirely metaphysical question, is resolved by Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, the great occult philosopher, who demonstrated that the germ of ideas is only innate in us, just as the oak is only in germ within the acorn. Sensation comes to develop and bring to fruition certain of these germ ideas, just as heat and water develop the oak. To the materialistic theory of ideas derived solely from sensations, occultism comes to show the common point of union, revealing the character and the mode of development of germ ideas and their intermediary role between the various planes. It is also very difficult to classify it within a well-defined metaphysical system. Occultism intends, in effect, to play a universally conciliatory role among all systems. It teaches that dualism and materialism are true if their application is restricted to the physical plane. However, that one errs if one wishes to extend this application to other planes, just as pantheism is the system that best clarifies life and the laws of the astral plane, much as pure spiritualism, going as far as mysticism, can alone effectively account for the laws of the divine plane of creation. However, occultism forbids itself an exclusive stay on any of these planes, just as it forbids the exclusive adoption of any of these metaphysical systems. It aims at the conciliation of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in a close and universal union that it calls mythesis. By idealizing materialism and materializing mysticism, occultism absolutely defends itself against being a pantheistic system and, if it were necessary to classify it, we would have to create a new division and catalog it as a synthetic and integral idealism. In antiquity, every science, even that of numbers, had a physical section and a metaphysical section. Later on, only the physical section became the object of constant investigations by the classical schools, and from this resulted the marvelous conquests of experimental science, disdaining more and more metaphysical digressions. This was the domain abandoned to occultism, and it always preserved the study of each science so well that, at the present time, its adepts claim that only alchemy contains the metaphysics of contemporary chemistry, just as astrology can provide a philosophy to astronomy, and magic, a key to the real causes and forces of which physics merely ascertains the most material effects. Thus, an occultist, initiated in any initiatory school, considers as a vulgar profane anyone who says that alchemy, astrology, and magic were nothing more than the first and most primitive form of chemistry, astronomy, and physics. The plan of our exposition does not allow us to be prolix regarding the metaphysics of each science, and we are obliged to choose only a small number of applications. In natural history, occultism provides very interesting theories regarding the evolution and organization of the species of individuals. For occultism, in fact, it is the astral body that fabricates the physical body, in the mother's womb or in the egg, as the case may be. The evolution from one type to the immediately superior type therefore takes place only on the astral plane. The form of a dog's body, for example, becomes, after the sufferings of an earthly incarnation, the force or astral body of a future monkey's body. Such is the reason that prevented experimenters from ascertaining on Earth the direct passage from one species to another, although this passage is evidently, for the anatomist as for the observer, the evolution of the embryo. It is the descending and involutive current that regulates the spiral of evolution on all planes of the universe. If occultism presents itself to us with such a personal character in these first two acceptations. Logic. Even here, occultism will show its originality through the use of a method that is almost exclusively its own. Analogy, which supports deduction and induction in all occultist works. The great difficulty in employing this method is not to confuse analogy with similarity and not to believe that two analogous things are necessarily similar. Thus, the brain and the heart are analogous in occultism and are far from being similar. This relates to the doctrine of correspondences, of which we have already spoken a few words. It is the things placed in the same column of correspondence that are analogous, and the character of the analogy is determined by the general meaning of the entire column. Thus, according to the philosophical anatomy of Malfatti de Montereggio, the stomach, the heart, and the brain play the role of embryos, respectively, in each of the three centers, abdominal, thoracic, and encephalic, in which they are contained. These organs are, therefore, analogous to one another according to this function. However, one can establish their analogy according to other elements of assessment. If we consider, for example, these three organs from the point of view of their general function, we will note that the first directly receives food from the outside world, the second atmospheric air, and the third sensations. There is, therefore, an analogy from the point of view of the direct reception of an external object, and this analogy of the three receiving elements, food, air, and sensations, exists equally among themselves, because the analogy of two things to each other determines the analogy of all the constituents of those two things. One can see the considerable elasticity of this method which, beneath its apparent simplicity, is very difficult to handle with sagacity and precision. It also seems indispensable to us, given the exceptional importance of analogy in occultism, to establish a framework, an example of the use of this method applied to elementary anatomy and physiology, so as not to depart from our initial examples. Analogy is the theoretical method that occultists reserve for their investigations concerning the physical plane and the world of laws. It only allows for second-hand insights into the world of principles and the first causes. To penetrate this plane, advanced occultists in practice possess a method of vision into the invisible world formerly cultivated with care in the schools of the prophets, later used by the ecstatics and the mystics, and, in our days, preserved only by a few adepts of Chinese societies, Brahmanic fraternities, or by envoys from the higher planes. Here, too, occultism, which appeared to us almost as a simple philosophical system, slightly escapes the general method to appeal to mysterious practices, to which it owes its name, as well as the very ridiculous slander spread about it by the ignorant and the sectarian. This second method was almost exclusively used for investigations concerning the soul and its transformations after death, as well as the spiritual entities that populate the various invisible planes of the universe. Apollonius of Tyana, Jacob Boehme, and Swedenborg are, along with Louis Claude de Saint Martin and his master de Pasquale, the most well-known philosophers who employed this method, which caused them to be classified as mystics. We will speak of this subject again in regard to practice. The union of analogy and direct vision gave birth to the use of numbers and symbols, as practiced by occultists. Indeed, to avoid the errors that the inappropriate use of analogy could lead to, the Kabbalah provided a precious instrument of verification in numbers and their symbolic conception. Every number corresponds, in fact, to a characteristic idea and hieroglyph, so much so that the laws of the combinations of numbers verify the combination of symbols and ideas. Interesting teachings in this regard will be found among those of the Pythagoreans, who devoted themselves particularly to this kind of application. Plutarch summarized some of them in his treatise on Isis and Osiris. It is through this treatise that we have notions of the triangular and lozenge numbers admitted by occultists, as well as the square and cubic numbers. The same occurs with current arithmetic operations, to which occultists add one theosophical addition, which consists of, given any number from 1 to 9, adding all the numbers from unity up to the considered number. Take, for example, the number 5. To obtain its theosophical addition, one will add 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that is, all the numbers from 1 to the considered number 5. This will yield 15. The number 4 would form by the same process 10. 2. Theosophical reduction, which consists of reducing composite numbers of 2 or more digits to a single-digit number by the successive addition of all the digits that constitute the number until only one digit remains. Example: the number 25 reduces to 2 plus 5 is equal to 7. The number 34,224 reduces successively in the following manner. 3 plus 4 plus 2 plus 2 plus 4 is equal to 15. 15 is equal to 1 plus 5 is equal to 6. Therefore, 34,224 is equal to 6 in the final reduction. Louis Claude de Saint Martin, in his book on numbers, calls the result of the theosophical addition the essential root, and made it the complement of square roots and cubic roots. To conclude this brief digression on numbers, it remains for us to recall the meaning of those most commonly used from a symbolic point of view by occultists. 1. Positive principle. 2. Negative principle. 3. The first balance term, which results from the action of the two preceding principles. For the first material form. 5. Action of the active principle upon form, life. 6. The equilibrium of forces, the two involutive and evolutive currents of nature, represented hieroglyphically by the Seal of Solomon. 7. Action of the balancing force upon form, the first perfect term. 8. Equilibrium of forms, justice. 9. Triple ternary, symbol of the three material planes. 10. Action of the active principle upon the void. First complete creation, image and model of all others. Let us stop here with the examples which could be considerably developed. Each number has, effectively, at least 3 meanings with various adaptations. Kabbalists have worked especially on this question. Morality, as occultists understand it, is among the most rigorous and the most elevated. It is based, for the majority of schools, upon submission to all imposed obligations, whether by social condition or by trials, the acceptance of which is all the more indispensable as they are the consequences of past faults. Occultism teaches, in effect, that the spirit reincarnates successively in various physical bodies, and that we pay in the next existence for the unamended faults of a preceding life. Between each incarnation, the soul renders an account to itself of all previous existences and their consequences from the point of view of evolution. On the contrary, at the beginning of each descent to the physical plane, the spirit loses the memory of the past, which is necessary to avoid suicides that would become almost inevitable for one who was conscious of the faults they have come to expiate. This doctrine, much more than that of divine unity, constituted one of the most terrible mysteries of the ancient initiations, and it was taught under the veil of fable. The water of the river Lethe, which the soul drank upon leaving the lower regions, is an evocation of this mystery. The possession of power or riches is considered by the occultist as one of the most dangerous and difficult trials that can test man. If the powerful or rich person, forgetting that he is no more than a simple depositary of the vital force of society, makes himself the center and disposes exclusively for himself and his own of what has been entrusted to him, then the punishment will be much more terrible. When a young student, deeply moved by the apparent iniquities of destiny, came to protest to the master, the latter would, for an instant, evoke the images then inscribed in the secret light that enveloped the individual, and the student, recognizing the presently unhappy man in this formerly wealthy one, who had helped the poor only out of vanity, understood and blessed his master. The moral teachings of occultism have almost always been exclusively practical, and disciples are turned away from suicide not by delivering philosophical discourses to them about the nothingness of this act, but by placing them face to face on the astral plane with the spirit of a suicide and showing them the indescribable horrors of that unhappy solution. The same applies to death, the phases of which are all studied experimentally. A morality based on such practices is necessarily much more powerful, especially when personal investigations have led the postulant to verify the exact nature and the truth of most Christian traditions. It is curious to note that the illuminated Rosicrucians always showed themselves to be ardent apologists for Christianity, while being, at the same time, of great severity towards the clergy, whom they accused of having delivered Christ to Caesar by participating in the sharing of temporal power and gold. Likewise, the Church, in all eras, has made the greatest efforts to repress the occultist movement, which forges men of such faith and such independence of character that she wishes to see in them nothing but agents of hell. One can summarize occult morality in a few propositions, the developments of which will be found in the works of Eliphas Levi. The occultist must know how to abstain, to suffer, to pray, to die, and to forgive. Once again, what interests us in this morality are not so much rules that we will find, more or less, in all moralists, but the practical path of demonstration through direct vision. This path requires masters worthy of the name, and these flee from rumor and renown, and are known to only a few. Those whom the public takes for leaders are generally those who have been delegated to the works of propaganda. These are the realizers, the men of action, the arms of the initiatory organisms. Some believed or wished to believe that it was only in the East that masters existed. This is a mistake. Our information allows us to affirm that there exist, not in Paris, but in certain cities of France, masters of different degrees who live far from noise and publicity, and who are unknown in their true character even to their closest neighbors. Aesthetics is, perhaps, the part of philosophy in which the influence of occultism was most considerable. Symbolism is, indeed, one of the most developed sections of the occult, and it guided not only sculptors and painters initiated into the secret tradition, but also poets and historians, from highest antiquity up to the 16th century of our era. Let us point out, pursuing this highly characteristic trait of historians instructed according to the occultist method, that they never stop at the history of individuals and only interest themselves in the history of the principles that individuals embody. It was the exclusive method of the ancients, continued by the prophets. They wrote the developments of initiatory science of all times under the name of Hermes. When modern writers wish to apply their current individualistic processes to this historical symbolism, they were surprised to find that Hermes would have been the author of 20,000 volumes, which is a great deal for a single man, but which is quite normal for the Central University of Egypt. The same applies to Zoroaster and Buddha, which designate principles incarnated in a series of men and not simple individuals. When contemporaries realized their mistake, say the occultists, they committed another by denying any personal existence to the individuals who had manifested the same principle in different eras, and by attributing the works of Homer or Moses to collectives of men of the same time. The truth, for the occultist, lies between these two extreme theories, and this was a useful point to remember in passing. The Iliad, the Aeneid, the Golden Age, and the Divine Comedy are histories written according to the keys of occultism, and which describe the mysteries of physical or astral initiation. All Gothic cathedrals are likewise symbols of stone, words of granite, just as are all the ancient and modern temples of India and China. So as not to be more prolix than is reasonable on this particular point, let us give a very clear example of the application of the occult to aesthetics, and this will help in understanding the rest. We shall take the symbol of the Sphinx. According to occult tradition, the Sphinx was placed a short distance from the pyramids and served as a secret entrance, thanks to a door situated between its paws. If we analyze this symbol from the point of view of its form, we will find that the Sphinx, exactly as it came from Chaldea, was composed of the following elements: a human head, eagle wings, lion paws, and bull flanks. What, then, does this symbol mean? So that the meaning would never be lost, a symbolic story, that of Oedipus, commented on the image of stone. This story said that the hero had guessed the riddle of the Sphinx, and that the word to this riddle was man. All these signs, which seem taken from animality, the bull, the lion, the eagle, are actually characteristics of man, and Hermetic analogies will clarify the matter. The bull is the symbol of the lymphatic temperament and of the material force that is within each of us. It is the key to abdominal psychology or the instincts, whose formula is to keep silent. The lion is the symbol of the sanguine temperament and of the anemic force, of courage and of anger. It is the key to thoracic psychology or the passions and sentiments, whose formula is to dare. The eagle is the symbol of the nervous temperament and of unreflecting intellectual force, of enthusiasm and of unbridled imagination. It is the key to inferior cerebral psychology, the science of books, whose elevated formula is to know. The human head is the symbol of the bilious temperament and of reflected will, of reason, which dominates and restrains the instinctive impulses of the bull, the anemic ones of the lion, and the enthusiastic ones of the eagle, and which brings everything back to the unity of consciousness illuminated by the Spirit. The formula of this psychology, not only intellectual but primarily spiritual, is to desire, in the sense of willing through love, as indicated by the Spanish and Portuguese, care. The elements that compose the Sphinx, transposed, according to the analogical keys, from the form to the corresponding idea, were summed up in a formula of intellectual and moral conduct. To know, to will, to dare, to keep silent, which has guided the initiates of all schools since the most remote antiquity. The Sphinx, the door of initiation, is the petrified word of occult science and its mysterious tradition. And since the laws of symbolism are universal, open the Gospels and you will note, on the frontispiece of each of them and as the symbol of each evangelist, one of the four forms of the Sphinx. This is why there is a Christian Kabbalah, with the Apocalypse as its special symbolism. Thus, all aesthetic manifestations utilized by antiquity were immediately reducible to ideas, and this was thanks to the symbolism of occultism. We could multiply the examples of these applications, which are little known today and which, nevertheless, served as a model for the associations of builders who erected most of the Gothic cathedrals. All the arts received life under the influence of occultism and, since this influence was neglected, the path of inspiration to the living springs has been largely obstructed, the adepts of occult science affirmed. With theodicy, we shall encounter the truly mystical side of occult theories. The problems of evil, its origin and its end, the fall and reintegration of the human soul, the distinction of divine attributes, and the relationships between God and nature were, indeed, the almost exclusive object of investigation for the greatest mystics of the occultist school, the best known of whom are Jacob Boehme, Martinez de Pasquale, Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and, in the transcription of Moses's ideas in this regard, Fabre d'Olivet. It is the ideas of these masters that we shall summarize, in the best possible way, in this section. As for the problem of evil, it can be summarized in these few lines. The origin of evil must be sought within the human being and nowhere else. Chaim Ronsky, in his Messianism, provides the greatest details on this point. The cause of evil is the fall, and the end of evil will be the reintegration of man into God, without the former losing anything of his personality. Such are the points that we shall endeavor to develop. For the occultists, Adam did not represent an individual man, but rather the collectivity of all men and women subsequently differentiated. This universal man occupied the entire intra-dash, or rather interzodiacal space, in which he reigned as sovereign. This occurred after the fall and punishment of the rebel angel, who became the animating principle of matter, which did not yet exist as a realization, and was nothing but a germ, like the fruit within the seed or the child within the maternal egg. Adam's imagination, which Moses calls Iska, incited by the rebel angel, presented to the spirit of universal man a reasoning that has almost always provoked falls, not only universal ones but even individual ones, across all epochs. According to this reasoning, that which resists and is seen immediately and materially is more powerful than that which is ideal, invisible, and perceptible only to the spirit. Adam, seduced by this idea from his imagination, imagined that, by providing the principle of matter with the means to pass from the state of a germ to the state of reality, he would unite the spiritual power of God with the material power, whose consequences were still unknown, and that he would thus be the master of his Creator. This idea, once conceived, was put into execution by Adam's free will, and he came to give matter, through his alliance with it, this principle of existence that it lacked. Soon he was enveloped, in all his spiritual organs, by this matter that he believed he could direct at his will, and the principle of egoism, revolt, and hatred that constituted the essence of matter strove to drag down unto itself all of Adam's elevated aspirations. The Bible, translated exoterically, says in this regard that the Adamic being was covered in an animal skin, a symbolic allegory of the real history of the fall. It is, therefore, through the exercise of his free will that the materialization of universal man was carried out, and on this point all the mysteries are unanimous. God only had to intervene to mitigate the consequences of this catastrophe that had materialized, at the same time as Adam, all of nature, which constituted his domain and which had to participate in his rehabilitation. To mitigate the act of his creature, the Creator, utilizing time and space which were corollaries of the physical plane, created the differentiation of the collective being. Each cell of Adam became an individual human being, and Iska became the principle of universal life and plastic form Eve. Man, since then, has had to purify the lower principles he had added to his nature through suffering, resignation to trials, and the surrender of his will into the hands of his Creator. Reincarnations were the principal instrument of salvation and, as all men are cells of the same being, individual salvation will not be total until collective salvation is achieved. To aid in this salvation, the divine word came to participate in incarnation and its consequences, and to master physical death and its terrors in its own domain. It can be seen that the occultists, in their mystical conceptions, are essentially Christian and theosophers, such as Jacob Boehme and L. Claude de Saint Martin, are characteristic from this point of view. Man must, therefore, work not only for his salvation, for his reintegration, as Martinez says, but also for the reintegration of the other created beings. To achieve this end, the mystics formed associations, of which several currently exist. This history of the fall and reintegration, about which we have been somewhat prolix, because it is characteristic and allows one to begin reading an entire literature that is generally inaccessible, is permanent and restarts in its broad outlines for each human soul. Incarnation in physical bodies represents, in fact, the first fall and the resistance or submission of the incarnated soul to the passional attractions of the physical plane will destroy or constitute the second fall. Regarding the other points of theodicy, occultism generally aligns with Kabbalistic doctrines. Thus, the constitution of God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was the subject of important developments on the part of Guillaume Postel and the Christian Kabbalists, whose works Pistorius compiled. The proofs of the existence of God derive, for the somewhat advanced occultist, from the direct vision of the invisible plane, and, for the student, from absolute adherence to the word of the Master. Therefore, such a discussion seems useless to the initiates. God is conceived as absolutely personal and distinct from creation, in which he is present just as the spirit of man is present in his body, without losing anything of his unity. In the same way, God is in us and it is within us, and not in a region situated above the clouds, that we must therefore seek him and find him. The divine emanations in action, everywhere in nature, determine three fundamental planes of action: the plane of emanation, the plane of formation, and the plane of materialization. It is sufficient to know the three worlds of the Kabbalah to understand all these divisions. Chapter 3. Sociology. We cannot conclude the philosophical exposition of occultism without speaking of sociology, which was always the object of continuous studies in those temples that sent forth legislators, such as Lycurgus, Solon, Pythagoras, Numa, etc., etc. Since the most remote antiquity, society has been considered by occultists as a living organism. A contemporary writer who devoted himself to this question, François-Charles Barlet, even strictly determined this law, showing that society is a living entity that has the power to create and modify its most specialized organs. The truly moral society, for the occultist, is therefore the one that most closely approaches the ternary constitution of any higher organism and which comprises a social head, thorax, and abdomen. Political economy is the representation of the social abdomen. The juridical and military forces represent the dual thoracic polarization, and the universities and religions the intellectual part of society. A state organized according to this conception, termed synarchy by Saint Yves d'Alvedra, would have three chambers: an economic chamber, a juridical chamber, and a university and religious chamber. Suffrage is strictly professional, with everyone voting according to their social situation in one of the three planes. This organization has the merit of not merely being a theoretical conception, as it functioned for several centuries and, alone, lasted longer than all subsequent forms combined. Saint Yves d'Alvedra dedicated immense erudition and a very real talent to this demonstration in his missions. Concluding the exposition of this theory, which is so intricate that a considerably more extensive plan would be necessary, we shall now begin the part on the application or the practice of these various theories. Chapter 4. The practice of occultism or magic. In the same way that the occultist demands moral aptitudes from his disciples, in addition to intellectual knowledge, he also subjects his disciples to a particular training, which applies to diet and respiration, and is destined to ensure the power of the will over the organism on all its planes. It is only after this preliminary training that the occultist becomes aware of the latent forces enclosed in nature and in man, not yet discovered by ordinary science, although the latter approaches them more every day, and he can understand all that is hidden regarding truths and errors about this term of magic. Therefore, before undertaking the study of the various magics, human, natural, infernal, and divine. Let us deal with this training and its results. The highest product generated by the human organism in its purely mechanical part is nervous force, and all the activity of the apprentice will be devoted to obtaining this nervous force as pure and delicate as possible, then to concentrating this force, thus purified, as quickly as he can, in a very limited point of the organism, of the brain, or even of the exterior, because this force can be projected at a distance. Now, the production of nervous force is directly linked to diet, and its purification to the very purity of that diet, supported by appropriate breathing exercises. The most proper diet to act effectively upon the nervous force is that which includes the fewest animal substances, and in this regard, the Pythagorean diet is the most favorable. However, this diet, like the fasting of many modern religions, was only practiced for a certain time, 40 days at most, in all its rigor. Afterward, the student returned to the attenuated mixed diet or remained exclusively vegetarian, according to his temperament or taste, or according to the place where he lived. The main thing was to avoid introducing into the organism what Descartes called animal spirits. Also, all the animals that were to serve as food for the priests were killed according to a special rite, and not murdered as they are today. Stimulants were absolutely prescribed, and only frankincense, myrrh, and a few plants which acted directly on the spirit were utilized. The respiratory exercises aimed to increase or decrease at will the amount of carbonic acid in the blood, and this by retarding or accelerating the respiratory exercises. Through this training, the student entered into a more intimate relationship with invisible nature. The world of dreams opened up to him first, then direct vision and intuition developed progressively, and the first steps were strengthened on the path of the mysteries. Let us now begin the study of the various magics. Human magic, or that of the microcosm, encompasses all direct actions of human beings upon one another, and principally the action of the trained man upon the untrained man. Its key is the utilization of the astral body and its conscious direction, which immediately differentiates it from mediumship. It is in this that the progressive training through diet and respiration plays a capital role. The practice to be achieved consists, in effect, of obtaining the progressive conscious exit of the astral double out of the physical body. This unfolding, this exteriorization, as modern experimenters would say, forms one of the most interesting applications for the gallery, yet least actually utilized, of the true practices of high consciousness. Only apprentices and the ignorant can believe that the unfolding is anything more than the practice of psychic gymnastics. This unfolding of the human being, known since the most remote antiquity, is beginning to present itself to contemporary experimenters, still disguised under the facts of telepathy, spiritist mediumship, and profound hypnosis. All these facts are linked to the exit, not conscious but unconscious, of the astral body, and the latter is obtained much more easily than the former. In this kind of experience, the person is put to sleep, either by an assistant or under some other influence, and produces, at a distance, the displacement of objects without contact and under good conditions for examination. Occultism affirms that this is not an action of spirits, but merely an action at a distance of the medium's astral body. The observational experiences and examinations followed by Mr. de Roches and others in France and in England have come to confirm in all points the traditional affirmations of occultism, showing that there existed a close relationship between the movements of the medium's muscles and the actions produced at a distance and without fraud. Another series of phenomena due to the exit of the astral body are the facts of remote vision, obtained by Saint Anthony of Padua, by Swedenborg, and even earlier by Apollonius of Tyana, and unconsciously by some good patients of the magnetizers of the beginning of the century. It is through this process of direct vision that the affirmations of the various religious revelations concerning the states and transformations of the spirit after physical death are manifested. The spirit after physical death according to the revelations of direct vision. Of the three elements of which incarnate man is composed, the first, the corpse, returns to the earth or to any other modality of the physical plane, which lent its elements for a terrestrial existence of the spirit. The second, the astral body, decomposes into several parts, a lower one which spreads into universal life and, if necessary, helps to decompose the corpse. The other, higher one, becomes what Pythagoras called the chariot of the soul and envelopes the spirit in its astral evolution. The third, the spirit, is destined to subsist solely with the integrity of its consciousness, and it is this, in short, that requires the greatest interest. The occultist theory regarding it has not changed since ancient Egypt and is the story of the journey of the soul from the Book of the Dead, but understood in its true symbolism, which the occultist of the 18th century of our era and even that of the 10th will tell us, all citing direct vision in support of their statements. Let us resume, then, in detail, the departure of the spirit and begin at the moment of agony. At this moment, the bond between the physical body and the spirit has just been broken, as on the physical plane, and another superior one which will evolve up to the superior astral plane. This struggle is manifested outwardly, in normal cases by agony. The amount of astral that will accompany the spirit depends precisely on the elevated aspirations of the human being during his incarnation, and at the moment of departure, the spirit seeks to draw to himself the greatest possible part of astrality. He is helped in this task by the ancestors, a term under which are designated all the invisible beings who come to assist the soul in its departure. For earthly death is astral birth and vice versa. The ancestors are there nearby to receive the soul that comes to them, just as parents are here to receive the child born to the earth. Before going any further, let us remember that we employ the expression planes to clearly indicate that it is not a matter of determined locations, because time and space disappear starting from the astral plane, and everything there is at the same time on the same plane. Let us return to the spirit. The agony has just ended, each physical cell, until then attuned by the preponderant action of the astral body, takes on its autonomy. The decomposition of the corpse recommences, and each of the small cellular beings that constituted it heads towards its special affinities. For its part, the spirit goes through a period of perturbation, during which the consciousness seeks, with difficulty, to do without the vanished physical organs. This state of perturbation lasts for a greater or lesser time, depending on the assistance given on this and on the other plane to the spirit for its evolution. Finally, he awakens from his nightmare and realizes that he is more truly alive than on earth. However, new organs, signs of new faculties as well, have been born, and physical communication with the material plane rapidly becomes increasingly difficult, with only feelings serving as bonds between the two planes. Yet, the spirit remembers that it is not yet in its true center, and with satisfaction it seeks the second death, the death to the astral plane, which will hasten its evolution. This depends on the moral elevation of the spirit, and it must sustain veritable struggles with the entities of the astral plane that wish to tear away its lower astrality. Progressively, the evolution takes place, the glorious body comes, atom by atom, to replace the higher astral body, and the evolution toward the divine plane begins. This entire path is marked by judgments, trials, and various interrogations that Valentinus summarized very well in his Pistis Sophia. We now enter the cycle of the Book of the Dead and can stop here. Let us only remember that a new physical incarnation will often come to accelerate a delayed evolution, and let us say a few words about special cases, such as that of suicides. Afterward, we shall concern ourselves with the evocation of the spirit of the deceased. We take as an example the evolution of an average spirit, because men who, during earthly life, penetrated to the bosom of the second death do not have to stop on the path and only reincarnate by their formal desire and as missionaries, retaining the memory of the past and the power to converse directly with the entities of the spiritual plane. These men are the only legitimate masters, and we know them by their humility. The certainty of acquiring these mysteries holds more attraction, for an elevated intelligence, than astral projection on earth or other purely magical processes, which always conceal great dangers. However, these exceptional evolutions are, according to the opinion of occultists, very rare, and cases of downfall are, on the contrary, much more frequent. Among these cases, let us take as an example that of suicides, because this alone is sufficient to clarify all the others. Dante already shows us this unfortunate soul, having committed suicide for love after the death of his beloved, coming every day to the edge of heaven to hear it said, "Thou shalt see her only tomorrow." Now, all the schools that concern themselves with the constitution of the invisible plane, even the most recent ones possessing no tradition, such as that of the Spiritists, agree in identically describing the sufferings of suicides, which only find their analogue in those of criminals and murderers. Upon awakening from agony, the suicide victim realizes, with terror, that he is closely, albeit invisibly, tied to that body he believed he had left behind forever. Until the day marked for his natural death, he remains bound to this body, tortured by physical hunger and thirst, and witnessing the decomposition of the organs that could only have served him and which he himself destroyed. To these almost material sufferings are added the moral agonies and the terrors of the incessant struggle against the larvae of the lower astral plane, which come to claim their spoils. Intimately tied to the earth, which they did not leave despite their belief to the contrary. This kind of spirit obsesses weak brains and mediums, and many cases of sudden madness have no other cause, according to occultists. When the time of natural death arrives, the spirit of the suicide meets his ancestors, and very rapidly, he is reincarnated in a deformed body or becomes crippled, to begin anew the struggle from which he had deserted the first time. Only those who consciously practiced the inversive rites of black magic are punished with even harsher penalties, with those of criminals being even lower than the latter. We have said a few words about the possible evocation of spirits, and some new details are indispensable in this regard. Occultists differ precisely from Spiritists by the difficulty with which they admit real communications between the living and the actual spirits of the deceased. To fully grasp the objections raised by occultists in this regard, one must remember the theory of astral images, which we have discussed at length. All earthly facts are recorded, one might say photographed, in the astral light, and this rule holds true for ideas as well as for individuals. It is thus that a human idea is a force as dynamic and as material as heat and light. Hence the training of the will for the student. An idea leaves traces of its good or evil activities on the astral plane, and this trace can be found a long time later. The same occurs with the entire individual, who leaves an image of his earthly passage on the astral plane. It is this image that Spiritists almost always mistake for the real apparition of the one they evoke. In other cases, when there is no fraud on the part of the medium, the phenomena attributed by spiritists to spirits are, for occultists, the result of forces emanating from the medium and sometimes augmented by the aid of elementals. It is no less true that when occultists affirm the reality of communications between the two planes and admit that a communication is exactly from a deceased human spirit, they do so only by elimination and armed with all necessary proofs. Magic claims to be able to place its adepts in a position to practice the evocation of the dead. But the rites of necromancy are considered very dangerous, both for the evoker and for the evoked spirit. Only one exceptional path allows one to come into contact with the invisible plane without danger: theurgy. Only the masters, generally hidden under the guise of theurgists, have the power to act consciously upon the spirits on all planes of visible and invisible nature. To treat the subject completely, we must finally mention the theory of the sister soul, according to which evolved entities on the astral plane are formed by the fusion of two earthly souls that find each other after centuries of searching, each soul, moreover, preserving the entirety of its personality. This conception gives rise to interesting philosophical developments and has been utilized by poets. Such are the principal assertions that occultists base upon the dual authority of tradition and direct vision of the invisible plane. One will now understand the reply of a Brahmin, questioned by a Jesuit priest about the origin of his ideas concerning the transformations of the soul after death. But I have seen what occurs after death, and no revelation is worth this certainty, especially if one verifies it several times to take note of the details. We may end here regarding human magic, and let us now speak of natural magic, the true metaphysics of modern physics, and the one that many ancient Hermeticists preferred to study. Its purpose was to make the dynamized human will act upon the living forms of nature. Its key is the astral light acting in nature as the astral body acts in man. The study of this kind of magic is, in large part, based on astrology, the planetary septenary, and the zodiacal duodenary. All magical operations are, in effect, subordinated to the astrological state of the sky. This first point established, the operator endeavored to act upon the intelligences or spirits of different orders that actuate various planes of nature. For, to the advanced occultist, everything in nature is the work of spirits of more or less elevated degrees. The classification of these spirits plays a very large role in natural magic. Therefore, we must also dwell a little upon this very important and highly obscure subject. Spirits are divided, for occultists, into two primary and grand sections. 1. The spirits inferior to human nature, called by the ancients spirits of the elements, and by the moderns since Paracelsus elementals. These spirits are mortal, but they can acquire immortality by elevating themselves to human nature. To this category belong the sylphs or spirits of the air, the salamanders or spirits of fire, the undines or spirits of water, and the gnomes or spirits of the earth of the ancients and the Rosicrucians. Elementals act in nature as embryonic cells act in man. They preside over the construction, destruction, and defense of the sections they guard. Luis Miguel de Figueres is the contemporary author who described them best, under the names of humanimals and hominicules. It is these spirits that, being neither good nor bad in themselves, and acting well or poorly according to the impulse given to them, amuse themselves at the expense of attendees and mediums in spiritist seances, presenting themselves as Charlemagne or Victor Hugo, at will. 2. The second section is that of the spirits equal or superior to human nature. It is in this section that one must classify the planetary spirits of the Kabbalah and the spirits of the deceased, called by some modern occultists elementaries. It is also necessary to include in this section the spirits superior to man, those which the Church designates under the names of angels and demons, and a third category, known only to practitioners and designated under the name of astral spirits. It is these latter that Valentinus designated under the terms peaceful receivers, receivers of the torches, and archons in his Pistis Sophia. The Church wishes to see nothing but demons in them, because it has lost all the keys to the astral plane. All these spirits of the second section, having their own will, only come at the moment of evocations and conjurations if they wish to come or if they are forced to do so. One can only force them through conjuration and, if any detail of the ceremony is omitted, they have full power over the imprudent one who managed to be obeyed without being worthy. The magical ceremony therefore has great importance, and we shall summarize its main phases. The preparation for the magical ceremony, or rather, for the experience of ceremonial magic, consists of fasts, more or less prolonged, and various physical and moral purifications. Furthermore, the operator and his assistants must have prepared special garments and a cabinet of operation in the color corresponding to the chosen day. It is in this cabinet that the magic circle is drawn, formed by 3 concentric circles containing the divine names and the names of the angels of the day and the hour. The circle is the operator's true fortress, because, as long as he is enclosed within the circles, he is sheltered from pernicious influences. Besides the circle, the operator also possesses, as a means of defense, a sword and, as a means of command, a magical scepter, the preparation of which requires a special ritual. In certain ceremonies, which are tied more to Goetia than to magic, use is made of a blood victim. Once having entered his circle, the operator begins, in a loud voice, the call to the spirits. This call takes the name of evocation when we humbly supplicate the spirit, and of conjuration when we force the spirit, through threats and divine names, to manifest even against its will. Once the apparition is obtained, it is indispensable to pronounce the dismissal of the influences that have presented themselves. It is only after the dismissal that the operator can safely leave the circle. We have just summarized a general type of magical ceremony. It is understood that this general type is modified according to rituals and circumstances. However, what must primarily be noted is that occultists vigorously guard against evoking demonic spirits, and that they even combat the sorcerers who engage in this practice. Moreover, ceremonial magic is generally forbidden in the elevated fraternities where theurgy is, with good reason, highly preferred over it. The rituals of ceremonial magic are almost always manuscripts. The National Library possesses a very beautiful one, entitled The Clavicles of Solomon. The Library of the Arsenal possesses, mainly, rituals of sorcery. Among the printed ones, the best is the adaptation of Agrippa's 4th book by Peter of Abano. Modern translations have been attempted. However, they contain such errors in meaning that it is better to resort to the originals. Another great variety of ceremonial magic was the practice of the great Hermetic work, which was pursued between the laboratory and the oratory. The colors of the work reproduced the mysteries of creation, and the symbolic narratives of the ancient temples were generally nothing more than an adaptation of them. Moreover, all the details on this point will be found in the article Alchemy. It remains for us to speak of inversive magic, black magic, or sorcery. Stanislas de Guaita defined it very well. Setting into action, for evil, the occult forces of nature. While the magician makes every effort to aid the evolution of spiritual forces, The sorcerer employs all his forces to paralyze the free expansion of evolutionary forces, to the benefit of the forces of death and involution. In most cases, he who believes himself endowed with a malefic power is a poor ignoramus who possesses only a puerile secret of magnetism and who, then, uses his knowledge in the best possible way to terrorize his neighbors and extort money from them. For it is also a characteristic distinction of occultist schools of initiation to absolutely prohibit asking for or receiving gifts or money for personal needs, as a reward for assistance through magical means. Thus, talismans, which are generally simple fixators of magnetic forces, must be made personally by the one who wishes to analyze them, and must never be bought or sold, under penalty of the seller being cast aside by serious schools of occultism. The sorcerer who frankly enters into conflict with all the divine forms of the invisible is, in most cases, a monomaniac of pride or a madman. One should not believe that the light cast upon everything by 19th century science has made this type of great rebel against God disappear. One of the works of Stanislas de Guaita gives us a multitude of authentic documents about the abbot B, a defrocked priest claiming to be a disciple of Vintras, and who had established the headquarters of his operations in Lyon. Now, an investigation into the life of this so-called terrible sorcerer revealed various convictions, both ecclesiastical and correctional, which leave no doubt about the mental state of this supposed messenger from hell. Bewitchment, or action at a distance by means of an object called a volt or vault, was very correctly linked to deep hypnosis and the exteriorization of sensibility by Mr. de Roches in a series of curious experiments. One of the most characteristic consists of having someone hold a piece of wax far from the patient and pricking it with a pin or thorn. The patient experiences the sensation of the prick as if it had been done directly to him. A photographic print, whose negative was taken while the patient was in a state of exteriorization, presents analogous reactions even at a distance and without contact. These experiments and others of the same kind were verified by Dr. Lies and by myself in the light. However, they are too few in number to constitute anything more than indications, the exact character of which the future will take charge of specifying. The pacts that the sorcerer signed with his blood and delivered to the devil enter into the category of conjurations and cerebral consequences. The same happens with the Black Mass and other practices of the same genre, which are linked to Goetia. Country magic, with its naive formulas, is not sorcery, but rather, in most cases, mystic magnetism based on old Christian traditions. Thus, the formula to prevent burns from causing harm, fire of God, lose thy heat, as Judas lost his color, when he betrayed our Lord in the Garden of Olives, is a spell of the elementals, like all formulas employed in the countryside, and has nothing to do with Goetia. On the contrary, to recite the Sabbath and other details, see sorcery. Theurgy acts only by means of prayer and sacrifice. It is, therefore, the opposite, and we will only speak of it here because certain authors perceive it as being divine magic. The theurgist, in fact, does not possess the powers that constitute his quality except through acquired graces, whether by voluntary reincarnation or by anything else of the same nature. At his voice, and especially at his prayer, illness, and even death itself retreat and halt. Human brains are modified, and the astral clichés themselves can be changed or transformed. These clichés are the ones the prophets see forming on the astral plane, and any prophecy can thus be annihilated by the action of a theurgist. Such powers are given neither to ambition nor to pride, and to prevent any error, the law dictates that the theurgist can do nothing, by mystical means, for his own or for himself. Thus, although the physical plane is submitted to him, his children, if he marries to fully bear all social obligations, or his relatives otherwise are hostages to destiny. I personally know in France a human being endowed with such powers. I have seen, in the company of other medical colleagues, bone caries disappear in a few minutes, and tibias straighten themselves, to speak only of medical facts. The cure is all the more admirable the more the parents or the petitioners have suffered or have done anonymous good around them. It is often forbidden for the theurgist to heal the children of selfish millionaires, whereas a poor merchant or market woman will see her child instantly snatched from death. Time and distance do not exist for the works of theurgy, and the operator will see and act just as well from Lyon to Paris as from one street to another. It is forbidden to directly name those who have such powers, and silence is what they seek above all. I shall be permitted to comply with this rule, especially since we must simply differentiate, here, theurgy from magic. Let us say, in closing, that theurgy sheds vivid light upon Christianity, and that the cult of our Lord Jesus Christ, of the Virgin, and of the saints is inherent to these practices of high theurgy, which are nevertheless highly ignored and greatly feared by the Church, which confuses theurgists and sorcerers in the same superstitious dread. Few subjects present as many difficulties as the question of history, considered from the point of view of occultism. To avoid obscurities as much as possible, we will divide our exposition into two parts. 1. The history of the constitution of the various occult traditions. 2. The history of the influence exerted outwardly upon the profane world by the various occult fraternities. 3. Finally, we will conclude with some considerations on the paths of realization of contemporary occultism and on the exact state of this movement since 1898. Chapter 5. The Traditions. To know the teachings of occultism concerning the various traditions and their constitution, it is indispensable to make a preliminary digression on the human races and on planetary physiology, as occultists conceive them. We said physiology because esotericism teaches that each planet is a living being, and the Earth does not escape this general rule. Considered as an organism, the Earth has the continents as its organs, as we shall see shortly. Its circulation is constituted by the ocean as the heart, with an aerial arterial current from the ocean to the mountains via the clouds, and to the valleys via the dew of the rain, and a returning venous current via the streams and rivers. Respiration occurs through contact with solar emanation and through the cremation of the terrestrial atmosphere. An immense stomach of absorption and transformation that man utilizes for his own use, improving it. According to a very ancient tradition, confirmed by the revelations of Luis Miguel de Figueres, the Earth is formed by the welding, the intimate reunion of several planets on the path of dissolution. Each of these planets constitutes a terrestrial continent, and the nervous system, formed of metallic veins, has united everything under the same direction of a single spirit. The most advanced planet was Asia. Therefore, it was also tasked with successively instructing the others in divine matters. This mission ceased when humanity became mature enough for Christ to incarnate in Judea, at the meeting point of various terrestrial continents. One planet, after having accepted incrustation with the others, refused to continue the common evolution and was rejected, solitary and without advanced inhabitants, in the vicinity of the Earth. This planet is the Moon, and its abrupt separation was the cause of the ecliptic inclination and of an immense deluge. Terrestrial humanity, therefore, has different starting points and does not come from a single source. It likewise brought personal traditions, and only later did these personal traditions merge into one another, at the same time as men, flora, and fauna were mixing through exchange and commerce. These notions may seem original or bizarre, but they are indispensable to the knowledge needed to understand a multitude of ancient ideas about nature, and modern occultists preserve them entirely. The races number 4, differentiated by their origin and their color, and they held preponderance on the planet in the following order. 1. The Lemurians, originating from a continent that occupied the place of the present-day Pacific Ocean, and who must have been reddish-yellow. 2. The Atlanteans, originating from a continent located in the place occupied today by the Atlantic Ocean. They had red copper-colored skin. 3. The Blacks, originating from present-day Africa. 4. The Whites, originating from the vicinity of the North Pole and the European continent, the last to evolve. For each continent, like each man, each family, and each nation, has its periods of youth, mature age, and old age. Some even have alternations of sleep, of submersion in water, and of awakening, separated by the deluges that the Brahmins have perfectly fixed in their chronology. Now, the occult tradition currently ongoing among the whites has necessarily undergone the influence of all the preceding traditions, which compels us to say a few words about each of these traditions, all derived from a single source to which the seers always refer. Of the Lemurian tradition, we possess only a few fragments preserved in Tibet and in some Taoist centers in China. This tradition, the closest to unity, was mainly mathematical and strictly allied number to idea. Of the Atlantean tradition, on the contrary, we possess many fragments. The Atlanteans had, in fact, colonized all the southern coasts of Europe, and the Iberians, the Etruscans, and the Egyptians are Atlantean colonies. After the catastrophe that submerged almost the entire primitive continent, the colonies became centers of the utmost importance for subsequent races. The Atlantean tradition, known primarily through the hieroglyphs and monuments of primitive Egypt, studied the absolute in all its forms. The Black tradition attached itself particularly to the study of the astral plane in all its aspects. Thus, all figures of demons, and all evocatory ceremonies of astral spirits, take their origin from this tradition. Such are the elements, very briefly summarized, in the presence of which the white race will find itself in the course of its various peregrinations, which we will now summarize according to Fabre d'Olivet. The cradle of the race was, therefore, located in the vicinity of the White Sea, at the time when the blacks dominated the planet and had settled throughout southern Europe and in most of the old red colonies, which they had conquered by force, but whose arts and intellectuality they had adopted. This is the very reason why the black race experienced such a rapid decline. Placing all its trust in physical strength and military valor, it neglected its own intellectuality, and complete decadence followed its first failures. The black explorers, adventurously launched into the immense northern forests, discovered the first specimens of the white race who had advanced a bold vanguard to the south. We will not summarize the incessant struggle between the two races following this discovery. We will simply say that everything originated to the benefit of the whites, who, in a few centuries, drove the blacks back to the southwest, near the Sea of the Blacks and into India, which was still under the power of the blacks. There was a time, say the chronologies of the Brahmins, when India was under the power of the Ethiopians. It was the epoch of Druidism in Europe near 10,000 years before Jesus Christ, and the continent was divided thus. To the east, the land of horses, Rossland, cradle of the race. Advancing to the west and the south, one found successively the elevated land, Poland, and the divine land, Deutschland. It is at this moment that the first exodus of the whites into the south is placed. A large party of whites bypassed the Black Sea, reached Arabia, and constituted the nucleus of those hard-headed men from whom, later, the Hebrew people derived. Let us now speak of Ram. Ram was a druid to whom a dream revealed the method of employing the tincture of agaric to cure leprosy, which threatened to completely destroy the white race. It is from then that the cult of the agaric by the druids dates. Made very popular by his discovery, Ram was condemned to go bear a message to the ancestors, that is, to have his neck cut, in a grand ceremony, by the druids, who were then very powerful. There was only one means of avoiding this sad end: exile, and Ram exiled himself, followed by several thousands of Celts who joined his fortune. Ram directed himself first toward the Black Sea. Then he bypassed it and settled near the Ural Mountains, where he prepared, over several years, the execution of his great project, the conquest of India, which was under the power of the blacks. When everything was ready, he boldly launched his Celts upon the blacks, and in a few years the latter were driven back to the island of Ceylon, where they were definitively crushed. According to the occultists, the historians who follow the descent of the Aryans from Asia into Europe begin theirs only at this point, and ignore that the Aryans returned to Europe after having come to conquer Asia. It is from the Brahmin archives that occultist historians claim to have drawn this information, which certain modern archaeological discoveries would tend to confirm in their broad outlines. Ram constituted his tradition, uniting the cult of the ancestors with the red tradition and the black tradition already implanted in India, and changed his name, which meant Ram, to Lam, which means lamb. Lamaism thus came to unite with Brahmanism in the constitution of the Oriental tradition of the whites. Let us now draw attention to the important question for the ancients concerning the symbolism of colors. This question has just been definitively resolved by one of the greatest among the investigators who sought from occultism the key to ancient civilizations, Saint Yves d'Alvidre, in his chromatic key of symbolism. The Brahmins, representatives of the Orthodox tradition, had as a symbol the white color of the conquering race. Sanskrit, a reflection of the true sacred writing, was written from west to east to indicate the origin of the conquerors. On the contrary, the writings of the Atlanteans and their derivatives were written from east to west, while the writing of the Lemurians was traced from heaven to earth and from east to west, and the writing of the blacks was written from earth to heaven. Everything strictly corresponded to everything in each tradition, and the mode of writing indicated analogically all the rest. The Orthodox whites had, as we said, the color white when the first schism broke out, a schism at once scientific, philosophical, and religious. After 35 centuries of tranquility, this schism of Urshu suddenly broke out and the rebels left India, taking the color red as an emblem and seeking to combat the creations of the Orthodox everywhere that these rebels were strongest. They were called shepherds, Ianges, to indicate their ignorance of the mysteries and their lack of intellectual references. The shepherds left India, invaded Asia Minor, then Arabia, driving ancient Celtic colonies back to the desert. One of the streams of invasion went to found Tyre, whence purple, the mark of the shepherds across the world, became the symbol and representation of absolute kings, despising the authority of tradition, of the tyrants and the Tyrians of every race, whom the initiates fought everywhere with all their strength. A torrent of these shepherds, powerful solely through brute force and contempt for the laws of civilization, invaded Egypt and seized the throne, forming the dynasty of the pharaohs. Fortifying themselves alongside India, to avoid a total loss of all ancient tradition, the priests of Osiris, in constant relations with the primitive centers, created the great mysteries that were going to play a very considerable role in the history of humanity. It is, in effect, from these Egyptian temples which had become, by 2600 BC, the central university of the West, that emerged the revealers and legislators tasked with going to combat everywhere the nefarious work of the tyrants. These great men, who did not acquire science until after very harsh physical, moral, and spiritual trials, radiated throughout the West, and it is enough to cite Lycurgus, Solon, Numa, Minos, Pythagoras, and Plato on one side, then Orpheus and Moses on the other side, to see the importance of this central university called Hermes, of which all the temples of the West were no more than secondary schools, in constant relations with the intellectual head that succeeded, making use of the Greeks as soldiers in crushing the efforts of the shepherds of their descendants against orthodoxy. One must understand the greatness of the mission of Pythagoras, who travels through all the temples of India and comes, afterward, to organize at the Olympic Games the resistance against the Persians, who were preparing to invade the West. One must understand this mission, conceived as the occultists conceive it, to understand the respect for the sacred that will unite later with this Pythagorean title. The Greek philosophers, almost always, were nothing more than signs of their masters, the Egyptians, whose intellectual paternity they later wished to deny. It is this struggle of initiation and of the initiates against tyranny that constitutes, for the occultist, the esoteric key of history. Let us not leave this symbol of colors without speaking of the attempt of the Orthodox initiate, who took the name of Fohi to organize, around 2700 BC, the civilization of the Far East, with the color yellow as the initial mark. Chinese is the only key still existing of what one might call an astral language, mainly if one refers to the ancient figurative characters Shanghin, which provide a path to the total reading of the Peruvian or Egyptian hieroglyphs. Let us leave now general history to occupy ourselves with the constitution of the secret tradition of Moses, which will serve as the basis for all the orthodoxy of the West, until the coming of Jesus. Moses created for the West what Fohi had created for the East. A people tasked with carrying through the ages a symbolic and initiatory summary of all ancient occultism, a holy ark, the Ba enclosed in some hieroglyphic characters that, later, Daniel revealed to Ezra in the form of the current square Hebrew. However, according to Saint Yves d'Alvidre, Moses wrote in Watan characters. The work entrusted by Moses to his initiates contained the synthesis of the science of the Reds, acquired by Moses in Egypt as a priest of Osiris, and of the science of the Blacks, acquired near his father-in-law Jethro, in the Temple of the Desert. These two traditions had also been strictly verified in the secret light of nature through ecstasy and direct vision, which had unified the revelation and brought to vivid reality the ancient chronicles of the wars of Iowa, by which Moses had been inspired. The intellectual creator of the Hebrews structured his book, composed of spirit, soul, and body, as an organism in the following manner. The body was the Masorah, or rules for writing or copying the sacred characters, with a prohibition against changing any of them under penalty of spiritual death. The soul, dual and indefinitely extensive like all souls, was the Talmud or juridical code with two poles, the Mishnah and the Gemara. Finally, the spirit of the work, which Moses transmitted only during his lifetime and in an oral form, was the Kabbalah. It is to this Kabbalah, transmitted more or less faithfully until the moment St. John concealed it within his Gospel and his Apocalypse, that the majority of Western initiatory societies, devoted to the defense of Christ, refer, whereas it is to Pythagoreanism that the pagan current refers. To summarize the teachings of the Kabbalah would mean reducing the entire theoretical section of this article to Hebrew terms. We shall return, therefore, to our historical exposition. The white tradition is thus constituted, with its particular character, from the time of Moses. However, there is another traditional current of a character even more political than intellectual. It is the Pythagorean current, to which many political secret societies were joined, and this brings us to our second section, the influence of occultist societies in the profane world. Let us cast a glance backward and picture this ancient civilization, termed pagan, by asking, what are its secret methods? They are these fraternities of initiates, emerging from local temples or from the Central University of Egypt, whose members circulated from temple to temple without the need for money, thanks to the law of hospitality and the signs of recognition that opened doors across the entire earth. For these so-called pagans knew nothing of religious wars and knew how to make the temple of the different astral or divine forces a sanctuary of the one truth. Plato, upon being enslaved, would owe his immediate liberation to the secret signs of the initiates. What was required, then, to become a member of one of these fraternities? Money? No, because everything was free, and the disciple was housed and fed at no cost throughout all his studies. Was it necessary to be a patrician and of noble birth? No, for initiation was open to all, slave or otherwise, and only one thing was demanded: unfailing physical courage, and an absolute detachment regarding the missions that might later be entrusted to the initiate. Following the trials, the initiation began and ascended, commensurate with the difficulty of the trials themselves, being progressively elevated to the moral plane, and then to the spiritual plane. Homer and Virgil described, under the guise of a descent into the underworld, the various phases of these initiations which, in antiquity, constituted the origin of the ruling class, one that was all the more truly directing as the actions of its members were more selfless and more hidden. It is in this light of the initiations, occultists say, that the entire history of antiquity must be taken and reconstructed. The great change that occurred in the regime of initiations was not due to the persecutions, though numerous, that the known centers suffered at the hands of the tyrants, but rather to the birth of Christianity. The Magi, representatives of the Chaldean initiation who had already given Ezra the lost keys, come to greet the religion of the West in its cradle, and the four forms of the Sphinx are seen to characterize, each in turn, the Gospels of the Divine Word. At the same time, the oracles fall silent, indicating that the watchword, coming from the invisible centers, was to give all possible support to Christianity, which alone was about to begin the struggle against Roman tyranny, which relentlessly pursued the destruction of all sanctuaries of high initiation. Thus we also see the initiates of all centers, under the name of Gnostics, provide considerable support to nascent Christianity. St. Paul would be the practical implementer of the new organism. However, St. John the Evangelist, the author of the Apocalypse, would forever remain its initiate. At this moment, all centers are in agreement in favor of the Christian revelation, and the struggle continues until Christianity would be ceded to Roman administration by bishops who preferred temporal power to spiritual power. From that moment on, persecutions against the centers of initiation become more vigorous. However, they are thenceforth directed by the Christian clergy who, under the pretext of heresy, seek to destroy all traces of the ancient tradition. It is then that this incessant struggle begins between free thought and Constantinople, and afterward, following the capture of this city, in the highly tolerant universities of the Arabs, involving those mysterious associations of Hermeticists, initiated knights, adepts of St. John, etc., etc. All these forms were grouped together in the Middle Ages, initially in Westphalia starting in the year 772, under the name of free counts or free judges, and later throughout all of Europe and part of Asia, starting in 1186 by the Knights Templar. The Templars were about to reconstruct the ancient fraternity of the early temples, with their signs of recognition and their agents stationed everywhere. They were preparing to endow Christendom with comprehensive instruction spread far and wide, when, in 1312, they were betrayed and soon dispersed. The survivors of the slaughter, understanding that their error had been to abandon the path of the ancient initiatory fraternities, established contact with the then existing representatives of the Pythagorean initiation, and laid the foundations for that association of the illuminated from which the majority of Masonic rites subsequently emerged. It is with regard to the secret societies that one will find details we have been obliged to summarize, so as not to exceed the limits of our subject, and we shall now see how, abandoning the path of material struggles, the initiates would call upon only the idea in service of their cause, concealing their endeavors under the veil of alchemical investigations and philosophy. Occultism and philosophy. It is not enough merely to assert the influence of occultism upon philosophy. It is necessary, above all, to prove this influence through dates and names. Let us, therefore, enumerate the principal philosophers whom occultists consider their own, and we shall simply recall that initiates and disciples of the esoteric tradition are recognized by their Trinitarian doctrine and by their admission of an intermediate plane or entities between the physical and divine planes. There exist, as we have said, two currents in the Western tradition: the Pythagorean and Platonic current, formed by highly erudite and wise men, yet generally opposed to Christian mysticism and of more pagan tendencies, and the Christian current, which encompasses almost all the encyclopedists of occultism and its greatest implementers. We are obliged to provide an enumeration, perhaps a monotonous one, but one that will so greatly aid bibliographical investigations that we cannot dispense with it. Chapter 6. Pythagorean and Platonic Current. Within the primitive Pythagorean school, derived directly from Egypt and the Atlantean tradition, we shall cite Pythagoras, Charondas, Lysis, Aristeas, Alcmaeon, Timaeus of Locri, Enopides, Archytas of Tarentum, and Stesimbrotus of Thasos. Within the academy, one must primarily consider Plato, Speusippus, Phormion, Crates, an initiate, Axiotheus, and especially Xenocrates, who strove to establish the connections between Platonism and Pythagoreanism by reducing ideas to their corresponding numbers. This is the same idea that Antiochus of Ascalon would adopt 1 century BC. We shall not specifically cite Aristotle because, although an initiate, he developed only exotericism in his writings, reserving esotericism for the oral instruction of a rare few disciples, among them Alexander the Great. Its apologists, ignoring the existence of esotericism, transformed Aristotle to such an extent that we do not consider any member of the Lyceum to be a true initiate. We shall also move on to the 1st century Neo-Pythagoreans with Euxenus of Heraclea and especially his illustrious disciple, Apollonius of Tyana and his successors, Anaxilos of Larissa, Moderatus, Nicomachus of Gerasa, and the initiator of Cato, Narca. We shall set apart beyond comparison the illustrious Apuleius, one of the last initiates of the great mysteries and one of the rare revealers of esotericism. Let us come to the Neoplatonists, those who shed the most light on the astral plane and the astral spirits, among whom we shall cite Arius Didymus, Thrasyllus, Plutarch, a disciple of Ammonius of Alexandria, who revealed, under jocular appearances, very profound truths in his treatise on Isis and Osiris. Albinus, one of the initiators of Galen, Maximus of Tyre, Calvisius Taurus, who counted Aulus Gellius among his auditors, Ptolemy of Alexandria, and, not to forget the initiate Arya. From the school of Alexandria, it would be necessary for us to cite everyone. After Numenius of Apamea, We pause at the name of one of the greatest initiates, Ammonius Saccas. Ammonius is reputed to have endowed Christianity with all of its ritual, the principle of which is drawn from Mazdaism, but he gave birth to such a pleiad of brilliant disciples that humanity must preserve his name. Among these disciples we will cite Herennius and Origen, the inspirer of Allan Kardec, Plotinus, much against his will, who, in turn, gave birth to two traditional currents, a Western current entrusted to Porphyry and an Eastern one entrusted to Emilius, who developed primarily mystical practice. Porphyry had as his successor, as head of the school, the illustrious Iamblichus, who was succeeded in the 4th century by Aedesius, followed by Eustathius as head of the school founded in Cappadocia. Let us point out the foundation of a new school, in Athens, by Plutarch of Athens, who initiated his daughter Asclepigenia, later an initiator, along with Syrianus, a disciple of Proclus, and we will conclude regarding this illustrious school that attempted to spread the mysteries by recalling the names of Hierocles, Hypatia, to whom initiation was fatal, and Olympiodorus and Damascius, who still upheld the fame of the school in the 5th and 6th centuries. We shall leave the purely alchemical current to arrive at 1400, where we will find to cite Nicholas of Cusa, Marsilio Ficino, the master of Pico della Mirandola, Francesco Patrizzi, and Giordano Bruno, the inspirer of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Schelling, and also Hegel. Spinoza opens the series of philosophers inspired by the Jewish Kabbalah in its non-mystical section, and his disciples Cooper, Keffeler, Parker, Law, and Wachter proceeded on the same path, more or less successfully. The most modern representatives of this Pythagorean current are Hamann, Bader, Statler, Friedrich Schlegel, and Weishaupt, creator of the Society of the Illuminati, who lived from 1748 to 1830. We shall end this list with the angel of this current of erudition and philosophy. We are speaking of Fabre d'Olivet, one of the wisest men that occultism has produced. Chapter 7. Christian Mystical Current. It is in this current that we will find the true masters of contemporary occultism, and its most illustrious representatives, whether ancient or modern. Thus, we will insist only upon the most important among them. They are, of course, the Gnostics who open the series, and it is with them that we must begin our citations. Simon Magus, Cerinthus, Saturninus, one of the Kabbalists of Gnosis, then Bardaisan, Basilides, and finally Valentinus, author of the Pistis Sophia, and the head of the Gnostic school of Alexandria, Carpocrates, highly esteemed by occultists, Marcion and Mani form the battalion of Christians who strive to unite faith with philosophy and science. Among the members of the Church, occultists claim St. John and St. Paul as being their own. The latter is the one who contributed most to the diffusion of the Trinitarian constitution of man into spirit, soul, and body. To discover the continuation of the Christian occultist current, we will leap to Tauler, to Eckhart, the founder of mysticism in Germany, and to his disciple Suso, creator of the Fraternity of the Friends of God. They are all adversaries of scholasticism, this pagan creation of the disciples of Aristotle's exotericism, under the guise of Christian orthodoxy. Also, all the initiates, whether orally instructed like Gerson, the audacious defender of the Trinitarian doctrine of the three spheres of man, or Petrarch, or illuminated by direct vision, like Rusbroek, called the Admirable, were adversaries of scholasticism, just as were the men of letters and reformers like Angelo Poliziano, Rudolf Agricola, and Luther. We arrive now at the encyclopedists and the realizers of occultism, the only ones who are considered, without discussion, by critics and historians, as being the mystics. Let us cite, in approximate order of dates, Reuchlin, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and his son Francesco, Cornelius Agrippa, counselor to Charles V and author of Occult Philosophy, the first real encyclopedia on the subject. Agrippa lived from 1486 to 1536. Ricci, Leo the Hebrew, and especially Paracelsus, the great realizer and the great master of scientific occultism, creator of homeopathy and the one who best studied the astral body and the astral plane, to which he gave their names. Cardan, the most humble, the wisest of the Illuminati, Guillaume Postel, the resurrected, Michael Servetus, Amos Comenius, Bayer, Menens, and Valentin Weigel, a disciple of Tauler and Paracelsus, complete this list, which continues with Jacob Boehme, the inspirer and guide of almost all the illuminated, Robert Flood, encyclopedist and realizer, founder, by order of the Rosicrucians, of Freemasonry, Portage, first a master, and later a disciple of Jane Lead, and finally Van Helmont the father, the Paracelsus of the 17th century, and his son Franciscus van Helmont, who exerted a very great influence on Goethe and Leibniz, who, furthermore, aided the publication of the Kabbalah Denudata and Angelus Silesius, and Poor lead us to Swedenborg. Swedenborg is primarily known as a philosopher and a seer, but he paid little mind to his work of realization, which is nevertheless among the most grandiose. It is to Swedenborg that, in fact, all the truly Christian fraternities of the West are connected, because he was the master of Martinez de Pasquale, who initiated Louis Claude de Saint Martin and was the head of this Martinist order, which later acquired a very great importance. Lavater, who can be considered one of the precursors of Spiritism, de Maester and Bonald, lead us to Wronski and Eliphas Levi, to whom, along with Louis Lucas, almost all contemporary occultists are connected. But before passing to the current epoch, it is necessary to go back to remember the names of several occultists who could not have a place in the preceding enumeration, reserved primarily for philosophers. We shall remember, therefore, the astrologer Dieli, Albertus Magnus, Bishop of Regensburg and Master of St. Thomas, to whom is attributed a grimoire that has nothing sorcerous about it. Albumacer, a 9th-century astrologer, and a Pomassar, a celebrated Arab diviner. Peter of Abano, known as Amagus, the Marquis d'Argens, born in 1704 in Provence and author of the Kabbalistic letters. Armida, alchemist and astrologer. Roger Bacon, Basil Valentine, Jean Bodin, Henri Boguet, Balthasar Becker, who dealt with the occult from a juridical point of view, Bori, alchemist to Queen Christina, Thomas Bunge, and let us not forget Cagliostro, charged with a mission by the Illuminati of Germany and considered a charlatan by the profane. Cagliostro, endowed with very extensive magnetic and necromantic knowledge, laid the foundations of the revolution, which he had come to organize. Let us cite next, still in alphabetical order, Dom Calmet, the author of the dissertation on werewolves and vampires, Tommaso Campanella, Catherine de' Medici, and Charles of England, the former occupying herself with sorcery and the latter with alchemy. Bartholomew Cockles, the most famous chiromancer of the 16th century, the demonographer Pierre de Lancer, the Jesuit Del Rio, author of Magical Investigations, the possessed Didyma, the German seer Engelbrecht, who died in 1642, the famous Attila, whose real name was Aliet, the renewer of cartomancy, the Abbé Faria, who discovered verbal suggestion, the 16th century seer Folgenhaver, the alchemist Fioravanti, author of The Treasure of Human Life, Nicholas Flamel, who, according to oral tradition, would still be alive in Asia Minor and was one of the highest adepts, the great Kabbalist Jacques Gaffarel, and Garanet, author of The History of Magic in France. Gaufridi, a poor madman who was burned as a sorcerer in 1611, the astrologer Luca Garrico, born in 1476 and in whom Catherine de' Medici had great confidence, and Urbain Grandier, that sorcerer against his will, executed due to the deposition of some hysterical young women. A Pope, Gregory XII, figures among the writers of occultism: the Spanish mage Grolandus, the alchemist Gussenhover, and the two Isaacs of Holland, Jean de Meun, author of the Romance of the Rose, which Dante completed with the Romance of the Light, and Saint Jerome himself, are considered occultists on Fernando Diniz's list. A special mention is due to Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit who had the skill to have his works printed at the Vatican. Under the pretext of attacking occultism, he provides a very complete exposition of it. Kircher is known for the invention of the magic lantern. He died in Rome in 1680. After him, we shall cite the popular astrologer Matthew Lensberg, then Lenglet du Fresnoy, author of the History of Hermetic Philosophy, which remains a classic in the schools of occultism to this day. The Marquis Legendre, author of the Treatise on Opinion, the demonographer Pierre de Loyer, the bard Merlin of the 5th century, the chiromancer Moreau, whom Napoleon consulted, Gabriel Naud, and Nostradamus, the most celebrated of both contemporary and ancient prophets. Among those we have not yet cited are also Gilles de Rais, a madman who gave birth to the legend of Bluebeard and was burned alive in 1440. Cosimo Ruggieri, another astrologer to Catherine de' Medici. Ramon Llull, considered one of the greatest masters of Hermeticism. The Count of Saint-Germain, a collective name for the Illuminati who entrusted Cagliostro with his mission. The sorcerer Troirechelles, burned alive during the reign of Charles IX. And the Abbé de Villers, murdered for having revealed certain secrets of the Rosicrucians. He was killed on the road to Lyon in 1673. And to conclude this list, Agrippa's disciple, Johann Weyer, who published important studies on demonography. From all these names, one can see the importance acquired by occultism across all eras and its influence on all the highest minds. There should be a special section dedicated to the influence of occult science on literature. When we recall that Shakespeare was an initiate, that Goethe practiced Hermeticism, that, closer to our time, Balzac was a Martinist, and that Edgar Allan Poe was affiliated with Pythagorean groups, we will have outlined the broad strokes of this influence. Let us now return to our own era and examine the state of occultism in the 19th century. We will avoid, as much as possible, personal matters and will deal only with the broad outlines and divisions of the occultist movement. Chapter 8. Contemporary Occultism. To precisely understand the immediate origins of contemporary occultism, let us cast a quick glance over the state of occultism in 1850. It was at this time that the discovery and public diffusion of the facts of practical occultism, which constituted magnetism and spiritism, forced the initiation centers to begin a propaganda campaign and to greatly expand their plan, in order to avoid the dangers of mysticism without verification and examination. On the other hand, the spread of materialism and atheism among the populace compelled occultists to engage in a struggle more ardent than ever. At this time, the representative of the current of traditional occultism was the Abbé Constant, better known under the pseudonym of Eliphas Levi. It is to the author of the Dogma and Ritual of High Magic that we owe the interest that many curious minds have taken, since that moment, in the Kabbalah and in theoretical occultism. Wronski, Louis Lucas, and others had sought paths of adaptation from occultism, but only Eliphas dedicated himself to the methodical teaching and the history of the occult. The Pythagorean current was then represented by the disciples of Fabre d'Olivet. Martinism remained in the shadows with Deluge and a few independent initiates. Eugene News was laying the first foundations of the Spiritist movement that Allan Kardec would soon establish. Baron Dupotet was enlivening souls with his curious experiments, and everything heralded an active renaissance of the occult. In 1882, the Mission of the Jews by Saint Yves d'Alvedre appeared, At the same time that a whole new generation of Eliphaz's disciples, Josephine Pelledan, Albert Jaunet, and Stanislas de Guaita, continued the study of scientific occultism. René Cayley founded the Review of High Studies, in which the wisest of contemporary occultists was to reveal himself, François-Charles Barlet. This review was the second attempt at the active diffusion of the occult. The first had been Magic, a magazine published in 1855 by Alcide Marino. It was around the same time that Papus was delegated to its realization by Martinism, and that he began the grouping of individual forces. This grouping was first initiated in the magazine The Lotus, directed with great authority by F. K. Gaboriau. The first Martinist lodges operated from 1887 to 1889 in Montmartre, under the aegis of Porel, and counted among their initiators Guaita, Pelledan, Papus, and all the occultists who had been isolated until then. In 1889, the independent group of esoteric studies was established, which became the Martinist Recruitment Center and currently has branches throughout Europe. At the same time, Papus founded the occultist magazine The Initiation, which has never ceased publication since. From 1889, a time when an international congress had gathered the delegates of 30,000 spiritualists from all schools, to 1898, the Martinist order constituted its Supreme Council of 21 members in Paris and expanded rapidly throughout Europe and America. It is time to see the organization of this order, which represents the most powerful center of diffusion that occultism possesses at the present time. On the frontispiece of all the order's official papers, one sees the Kabbalistic name of Christ, written in Hebrew letters. Martinism thus presents itself primarily as a Christian chivalry constituted outside of any denomination and, especially, of any clericalism. The order continues the struggle against materialism and atheism, and forms the gateway to most contemporary initiatic societies. Its organization remarkably facilitates the active diffusion of the ideas it defends. No member pays dues in the French lodges, nor any entrance fee. All expenses are paid by the officers. The Supreme Council is represented in each foreign country by general delegates and special delegates, who are granted the greatest initiative. The lodges and groups scattered throughout each country are linked to these delegates. In the United States, the lodges are so numerous that a general council was formed under the direction of Dr. Blitz, Sovereign General Delegate. However, what gives Martinism a very great power of diffusion is the system of independent initiators who are not linked to any center and can confer initiation directly. This system of initiators, functioning according to the law of cell generation, was created in the 18th century by Martinism and was also followed by Illuminism. Furthermore, here is the state of this order, according to the official report of March 1898. The number of Martinist branches is, in France, 27, Belgium, 3, Germany, 3, Denmark, 1, Spain, 3, Italy, 8, Bohemia, 1, Sweden, 9, Holland, 12, Switzerland, 2, Romania, 1, Russia, 2, England, 2. Outside Europe, Tokyo, 2, Egypt, 1, Tunisia, 1, United States, 19, Havana, 1, Colombia, 1, Argentine Republic, 7. Total 113. Besides the Martinist order, we shall also cite among the important occult societies the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, whose members are recruited exclusively by examination, and which grants the degrees of bachelor, licentiate, and doctor in Kabbalah, the latter being required to present an original thesis. Also corresponding to this organization is the Faculty of Hermetic Sciences, established in 1897 by the Martinist order at 4 Rue de Savoy in Paris, which offers courses and diplomas exclusively by examination. About 50 students attend the courses. The Faculty of the Occultists counts among its professors Paul Sadur, the secretary of almost all occult formations and the right-hand man of Papus. Sadur is a doctor in Kabbalah and an illuminated brother of the Rose Cross. Serge Bassett, a fellow of the university. Cicera, Rosabis, an engineer who graduated from the Central School. Dr. Rogier, and Jolivet Castellot, delegate to the Directorate of Alchemical Studies. Almost all occultists adopted pseudonyms, following in this the rule of the Illuminati. Most of these pseudonyms are taken from the Noctamaron of Apollonius of Tyana. The Council of Improvement of this faculty comprises François Charles Barlet, Papus, Dr. Mark Haven, Émile Michelet, Serge Bassett, and Sadur. The administrator is Lucien Michel, a licentiate in law. The Alchemical Society of France, of which Jolivet Castellot is the Secretary General, primarily pursues the study of alchemy. It has an official journal, Hyperchemistry. Almost a year ago, all the heads of the principal occult societies in Europe and America formed, under the name of the Universal Idealist Union, a kind of federation that gathers the representatives of more than 25,000 members and has newspapers and magazines in almost all languages. We shall cite principally in France, the Initiation Monthly, Veil of Isis Weekly, and Matins Monthly in Douai. In Norway, 3 orders, Nordic Occultism, and the Religion of the Spirit. In Italy, New Light. In Rome, The Secret World and Superscience. In England, Light. In London, Notes and Queries. In Manchester. In the United States, The Morning Star. In Louisiana. In Brazil, Thought in the Portuguese language in Sao Paulo. In Argentina, Astral Light in Buenos Aires. In Spain, The Medical Note in Madrid. In the Arabic language, The City in Tunis. In order not to mix 2 different things, we have included in this list all occult periodicals and any initiatory school or fraternity of some importance, because, following the success of these ideas, many directors of small publications without readers call themselves occultists to gain an audience, and we could extend this list with several periodicals that are linked to occultism only by their covers. All these societies and all these diverse works undertaken by the occultists require a special literature and, therefore, a dedicated publishing center. One of the founders of the esoteric group, like Julian Leger, a licentiate in law, Lucien Samuel, bravely established the publishing house that was to form the foundation of any serious propaganda, and it is to his bookstore that contemporary occultism owes a large part of its success. We will not speak of the Theosophical Society, except to mention it, as it is primarily linked to the Eastern tradition and only remotely touches upon the traditional occultism of the West, which alone forms the subject of our article. Alongside these centers, where occultism is the subject of continuous study and which produce students validated by examination, there are the recruitment efforts of the initiatory schools and societies. One must place, in the first rank, the experimental investigations pursued by a few independent experimenters, which come to confirm occult theories. As early as 1889 and 1890, the esoteric group had entrusted the direction of such studies to a former student of the Polytechnic School, Mr. Louise Lemerle, who obtained very interesting results. However, since that time, the investigations of Mr. de Roches have provided a considerable advancement to the movement, showing that experience confirms the occult tradition on almost every point. Finally, certain society lecturers spread the taste for these studies in the salons, and since they operate outside of all the centers that require examinations and know these subjects, as the occultists say, more than imperfectly, they serve as valuable, albeit involuntary, propaganda agents for the regular centers. Conclusion. There you have occultism, as we have been able to present it in a broad enough scope to show its general outlines, yet too narrow to enter into all the details that are analyzed in several hundreds of volumes. We are not here to judge this philosophical doctrine, and we can only point out its immutability across the centuries. End of the book. What is Occultism? A philosophical and critical study. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.